The door exploded inward just as I finished my diagnostic scan. I didn't care that the man cornered in the throne room was the Alpha King. I cared that his security protocol was a structural disaster. The coup was well executed. I'd give his traitors that. They'd anticipated his brute strength, his pack loyalty. They hadn't anticipated a human variable with a neural disruptor and zero respect for titles. Caius was magnificent in his rage, a force of pure predatory instinct. He took down 3 armed betas before they could flank him. Impressive. Also inefficient. He was leading with his right shoulder on every lunge, a tell any competent strategist could exploit. His attacks were strength-based, emotionally driven, utterly predictable. Beautiful to watch, operationally unsound. The systemic failure wasn't just his security protocol. It was his entire combat philosophy. My assessment was complete. The king was a high-value asset with catastrophic operational vulnerabilities. My mandate was simple: neutralize the immediate threat and extract the principal. I didn't fire a weapon. I accessed the palace's environmental controls through a back door I'd installed 3 days prior. As Caius lunged for another attacker, I triggered the localized sonic dampeners. The frequency was calibrated for alpha neurology. He dropped like a stone, consciousness severed mid-snarl. The traitors stared. I walked through the sudden silence, stepped over the king's fallen body, and secured the room. The professional headache began precisely 3 seconds later. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. Pure molten gold, burning with a fury that had nothing to do with the traitors and everything to do with me. His gaze locked onto mine with the intensity of an apex predator identifying the one threat in the room that mattered. He couldn't move yet. The neural suppressant would keep his body offline for another 90 seconds. But his eyes tracked me with absolute, devastating clarity. He'd be awake soon, fully functional, and he'd remember exactly who had put him down. My post-action report was 12 pages of dry analysis. The coup's execution, 87% efficiency. The king's defensive response, predictable, strength-based, emotionally compromised. My own intervention, a necessary correction of a critical system failure. I diagnosed the root cause as Caius's reliance on biological hierarchy over systemic security. He trusted teeth and claws when he should have been auditing firewalls. The first meeting post-takedown was in a medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and fury. He was propped up on a cot, muscles coiled, his scent an aggressive cloud of wounded pride and royal outrage. Most people would have bowed. I opened my data slate. You have 17 unpatched vulnerabilities in your perimeter defense, I said, not looking up. Your internal communications were compromised for 48 hours prior to the event. You're lucky they only wanted your throne and not your head. He stared. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the alpha command he was trying to project. It was like a pressure change in the room. Annoying, but not operational. You rendered me unconscious, he said, his voice a low vibration. I prevented your capture or death. The method was efficient. You touched me. That made me look up. His eyes were pure gold, burning, not with gratitude, with a kind of furious, fascinated violation. I had bypassed his strength, his title, his very biology. To an alpha king, that wasn't rescue. It was a profound humiliation. I closed the slate. I treated you as a high-risk, high-value asset in a compromised environment. My actions were protocol. I am not an asset. The words were a growl. You are the principal. Your continued functionality is the objective. My report stands. I left him there, simmering in his medical cot. The obsession began in that moment, I'm sure of it, not with attraction. With the need to dominate the one variable he couldn't control. The one person who saw his crown as a liability and his strength as a data point. He started seeing me not as a woman, but as a challenge to his entire world order. A problem to be solved. And there is nothing an alpha hates more than an unsolved problem. He summoned me to his rebuilt war room a week later. It wasn't a request. It was a royal command, delivered by a stone-faced beta who looked like he expected me to faint. The room was all dark wood and tactical holograms, the air thick with his scent. Oak, lightning, and a deliberate, aggressive musk meant to assert dominance. He stood at the head of a long table, a king restored to his domain, every line of his body projecting reclaimed power. He didn't speak when I entered, just let the silence stretch, let his presence fill the space. I took the seat directly to his right, ignoring the empty chair at the far end. I placed my data slate on the table with a soft click. You wanted an audit. His gaze was a physical weight. I want to understand how a human neutralized a palace guard. Your guard was irrelevant. The failure was systemic. I activated the holographic display, projecting a wireframe of the palace. Let's look at the facts. Your primary security assumption is biological loyalty. You trust pack bonds implicitly. I highlighted 36 points in blue. These are all access points controlled by betas whose primary allegiance is to you, personally, not to a protocol. That is our strength, he countered, his voice a low rumble. It's a single point of failure. Loyalty can be coerced, betrayed, or subverted. The traitors exploited it here, here, and here. I flashed red through the network. They didn't breach your walls. They walked through your trust. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. The move was designed to intimidate, to loom. And your solution? To replace loyalty with what? Your machines? My solution is layered redundancy. Loyalty is a variable. Protocol is a constant. I switched the display to a map of the Coup's progression. You see their path? They knew you'd be here, in the throne room, at that exact time, because you are predictable. Your daily patterns are a security leak. For the first time, something shifted in his eyes. The anger cooled, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. He was listening past the insult, to the data. How? They had a source, not a disgruntled guard, a strategist. I pulled up a final file, a psychological profile. The mastermind isn't who you're hunting in the lower city. It's someone with intimate knowledge of your strategic blind spots. Someone who understands that your greatest weakness isn't your back, it's your reliance on the old ways. The room went very still. The aggressive scent receded, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. He was no longer trying to dominate me. He was assessing me, the way I assessed a security grid. The predator had found a new puzzle. You know who it is, he stated. I have a 94% probability model. The evidence is circumstantial, but logically coherent. You're looking for a brute. You should be looking for a scholar. He slowly straightened, his eyes never leaving mine. The dynamic in the room had irrevocably changed. I was no longer just the woman who had humiliated him. I was the key to a threat he hadn't even perceived. The obsession deepened, twisting from personal vengeance into something far more binding. A king's realization that his only viable weapon was the intellect of the person who had bested him. He summoned me again the next morning, this time to a private solar. He didn't posture. He was seated, a contract already on the polished desk between us. I am offering you the position of head of royal security, he said, his tone stripped of its earlier aggression. It was a statement of fact, a royal decree. I didn't sit. I scanned the single page. It was a standard alpha employment contract, vague on duties, heavy on obligations of fealty and obedience. I placed it back on the desk. I don't accept. His eyes narrowed. You refuse a king? I refuse a poorly drafted contract. It lacks specificity and adequate protections for both parties. I retrieved my own data slate and projected a document onto the wall. This is a professional conduct agreement, my counteroffer. He leaned back, a flicker of that earlier amusement returning. You draft contracts for kings? I draft protocols for high-risk environments. You are currently the epicenter of one. I scrolled through the clauses. Section 4, Professional Boundaries. No application of alpha command or influence on the signatory. No unsolicited physical proximity inside a 3-foot perimeter without explicit operational need. All communication to follow the formal chain. He read the lines, his expression unreadable. You seek to leash me in my own palace. I seek to define the operational parameters. Emotion is a variable. This agreement is a constant. I advanced to the next clause. Section 7, Termination. Either party may dissolve the contract with 72 hours notice, no cause required. No biological or pack-based claims may be invoked to countermand it. That got a reaction. A low, incredulous sound. You think I would use a pack bond to trap you? I think you operate on instinct. This removes instinct from the equation. It makes our interactions predictable, secure. He was silent for a long moment, studying the projected text. And if I sign this? Then you get a security chief who will fix your palace, and I get a client who understands the rules of engagement. He took the stylus I offered. His signature was a sharp, slashing thing at the bottom of my slate. He looked up at me, the gold in his eyes bright with a challenge I now understood. We have an agreement, Vesper. We have a protocol, I corrected, saving the file. The signed contract became the new foundation. He had just legitimized my authority. I had just moved into the heart of his power. His home was now my operational base, and every rule in that document was a wall I'd built between us. His fascination wasn't with conquering me anymore. It was with understanding the architecture of the fortress I'd just erected. And a king, I was learning, hates nothing more than a door he cannot open. The test came 2 weeks later, a minor breach. A single infiltrator, likely a scout for the remaining traitor cell, probing the new defenses. The alert chimed softly on my data slate during a strategy session. Caius was in mid-sentence, outlining a retaliatory patrol. He stopped, his head snapping toward me, nostrils flaring as if he could scent the threat. "The Eastern Gate," he growled, already pushing back from the table. "They're testing us. We respond with force." He moved toward the door, the expectation clear. I was to follow, to witness his strength, his decisive reassertion of control. It was the Alpha playbook. Meet any challenge with overwhelming dominance. I remained seated. My fingers flew across the slate. Activating Protocol 7. He paused at the threshold, turning. Protocol what? Complete systemic lockdown and automated sweep. No one moves. Nothing gets in or out. On the main holographic display, the palace schematic turned a deep, pulsing crimson. Every corridor, every door, every ventilation shaft sealed in sequence. A soft, resonant hum filled the building as the dampening fields engaged. "You're locking us in?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm containing the variable. Your method would have sent a wave of guards into a potential ambush, creating noise, confusion, and opportunity for a secondary breach. My method isolates the threat and systematically removes it." I pulled up a real-time feed from a micro-drone, a silent, spider-like device scurrying along a ceiling conduit. The infiltrator is here, in the sub-level archives. He's trapped between Section D7 and the environmental seal. Caius watched the feed, his body rigid with suppressed energy. On the screen, the infiltrator, a wiry beta, pounded on a sealed door, then turned to try another. Every route was closed. He was in a perfect, silent box. "This is not a victory," Caius said, his jaw tight. "It is a containment. Where is the confrontation, the submission?" "The objective is neutralization, not theater." I tapped a command. In the feed, a panel in the ceiling slid open. A fine mist sprayed downward. The beta coughed, stumbled, and slumped to the floor, unconscious. "Neural inhibitor aerosol. Non-lethal. Efficient. He'll be in custody within 90 seconds, and we can begin interrogation without a single guard at risk." He stared at the screen where the now sedated man was being remotely tagged by a utility bot. The frustration radiating from him was a tangible heat. He had been sidelined in his own palace, in his own moment of crisis. His strength, his readiness for battle, had been rendered utterly irrelevant. He took a step toward me, not with posturing, but with a raw, unvarnished intensity. "You remove the fight. You remove the honor. You reduce everything to a system failure to be corrected." I met his gaze, keeping my voice level, analytical. "Emotion is a variable, Caius. Rage, honor, the desire for a physical confrontation, they are data points that cloud judgment. Protocol is a constant. It doesn't get angry. It doesn't seek glory. It simply executes. And it works." For a long moment, he said nothing. The golden fire in his eyes wasn't anger now. It was something more profound, a kind of bewildered, furious awe. He had been master of this domain through tooth and claw and will. I had just shown him mastery of an entirely different order, one that operated in silence and absolute control. His obsession underwent another critical shift. He no longer just wanted to dominate me or solve me. He wanted to comprehend the system itself, to understand the cold, flawless logic that could render a king's fury as obsolete as a stone axe. The predator had found a new kind of jungle, and he didn't know the rules. Protocol 7's success left a clean capture and a simmering king. The infiltrator was a low-level asset, but his interrogation revealed a pattern. The traitors weren't just disgruntled nobles. They were ideologues. They believed Caius's rule was stagnation, that his reliance on traditional pack dynamics made the kingdom vulnerable to the outside world. It was a philosophical coup, not just a power grab. This required a different analysis. Caius demanded to be part of the review, not as my client, but as my partner. He brought pack intuition, a deep sensory understanding of motive and loyalty that no algorithm could parse. I brought psychological profiling and predictive modeling. We worked in the intelligence room, a space now dominated by my holographic displays alongside his territorial maps. The friction was constant, but it was no longer about dominance. It was about methodology. He claims the mastermind is a scholar, someone I trust, Caius said, gesturing at the interrogation transcript. His scent was different here, focused, analytical. The aggressive musk replaced by a sharper, cleaner scent of concentration. My intuition says he's lying, deflecting. My profile says he's terrified. I pulled up the stress analysis metrics from the interrogation biofeeds. His physiological responses spiked not when we mentioned known rivals, but when we discussed your inner counsel's access to historical archives. He's afraid of someone with knowledge, not just authority. Caius frowned, studying the graphs. He didn't understand the numbers, but he understood the pattern. The archivist, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Lysander. He has access. He has the mind for it. But he's a delta. Weak. Non-threatening. Perfect camouflage. I cross-referenced palace access logs with the coup's timeline. Look, Lysander had authorized preservation work in the West Wing the day before the attack. That wing was mysteriously excluded from the traitors' path. They avoided it. Not out of strategy, out of preservation. He was protecting his own domain within the chaos. It was a hypothesis, a 72% probability. But before Caius could dispatch scouts to confirm it, my predictive algorithm chimed. It had been running a parallel simulation, analyzing the mastermind's probable next move based on the ideological profile. The result flashed on the screen. A high-probability target. The northern grain silos, the kingdom's primary food reserve. Not a military target, a symbolic one. A strike against the kingdom's stability, not its king. They won't hit the barracks next, I said, turning the display toward him. They'll hit the food supply. To prove your rule cannot provide basic security. To turn the people's fear from you to hunger. Caius stared at the prediction, then at me. His scouts, relying on traditional patterns of rebellion, were still sweeping the southern barracks district. The report of their empty search came through on his comm unit just as I finished speaking. The confirmation was silent, but it echoed in the room. My model had predicted reality before his intuition could perceive it. He didn't speak for a full minute. You were right, he finally said, the words simple, devoid of alpha pride. It was the first pure acknowledgement I'd received. The investigation stretched late into the night. The room grew quiet, lit only by the blue glow of my screens and a single lamp. The adrenaline of the discovery faded, leaving a strange, shared exhaustion. He didn't leave. He stayed, poring over the maps, cross-referencing my data with his own mental ledger of loyalties and slights. In the stillness, he asked a question, not about tactics or threats. Why do you do this work? It was a personal probe. I deflected with professionalism. Systemic security is a foundational constant. Without it, all other systems, economic, social, political, fail. I prevent failure. He leaned back in his chair, studying me in the dim light. That is the technical answer. I asked for the why. What in you requires this level of control? The question was a vulnerability scan. I shut it down. The why is irrelevant. The competency is what you purchased. He accepted the boundary, but the look in his eyes said he'd noted the evasion. The hairline fracture in my professional facade had been identified. He didn't press. He simply returned to the map, but the dynamic had shifted again. The investigation had forced a collaboration of minds. In the quiet aftermath, he'd attempted a gentle incursion into the fortress of my motives. He'd been repelled, but he'd seen the outline of the walls. The game was no longer just about the traitors outside. It was about the mystery within his own security chief. The shift happened a week after the northern silos were secured. The ideological mastermind, Lysander the archivist, was in custody, his network collapsing. The immediate threat was neutralized. The professional tension between Caius and me should have eased. Instead, it condensed, grew heavier. The shared victory had created a new kind of intimacy, an intellectual bond that was, in its way, more dangerous than any physical one. He found me on a balcony overlooking the training grounds, a rare moment of quiet. The aggressive posturing was absent. His approach was deliberate, his scent carrying something more complex than dominance, possession, mixed with a stark biological intent. He stopped inside my 3-foot perimeter, a deliberate breach of Section 4. His voice was low, stripped of its royal command, yet it carried the weight of millennia of instinct. The kingdom is secure, he said, not a question. The threat is contained. The variables, as you call them, are controlled. I didn't turn from the view. For now, systems require maintenance. Some systems are biological. He took another step, the heat of him a tangible presence at my back. The kingdom requires an heir. Stability requires a future. My biology requires a mate. There it was, the overt claiming move, framed not as a king's demand, but as a natural, inevitable progression. The final variable he thought he could control. I had anticipated this. It was the one piece of leverage every alpha, especially a king, believed they held. I turned to face him, my expression as neutral as if he'd reported a malfunctioning sensor. I understand the biological imperative. It's a common motivator, and a common point of coercion. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and withdrew a slim medical data slate. I handed it to him. My full physiological profile. Page 7, highlighted. He took it, his eyes flicking from me to the screen. He scanned the text, the genetic markers, the stark clinical conclusion. His brow furrowed, then smoothed into a mask of stunned comprehension. The aggressive tension drained from his shoulders, replaced by a cold, calculating silence. I'm infertile, I stated, my voice clinical. The result of a high radiation exposure during a corporate security failure 6 years ago. It is a permanent, systemic condition. He looked up from the slate, his golden eyes searching mine. The expected pity, the dismissal, wasn't there. Instead, I saw the rapid recalculation, the reassessment of my value on his personal chessboard. This is why you present it, he said slowly, not as a vulnerability, as a feature. It is the ultimate professional advantage, I confirmed, taking the slate back. I am the perfect security chief for an alpha king. I cannot be compromised by your need for an heir. I cannot be leveraged through pregnancy. I cannot be trapped by biology. My loyalty, should you ever earn it, would be purely intellectual, a choice, not a chain. The shock in his eyes crystallized into something sharper, more appreciative. I had taken the traditional alpha weapon, the claiming of a womb, and turned it into a shield. I had removed myself from the breeding equation, elevating our interaction to a purely strategic plane. He took a step back, respecting the perimeter once more. The game had changed irrevocably. The dynamic shifted from potential conquest to a far more complex seduction. He could not trap me with biology, so he would have to court my intellect. He could not command my submission, so he would have to earn my cooperation. The obsession, now stripped of its reproductive endpoint, focused with laser intensity on the one thing he could not force, could not bypass, and could not live without. The formidable, unassailable competence of my mind. The mastermind's capture was a data point, not an endpoint. Lysander's network was a symptom. The ideology, that Caius's rule was a relic, was a virus that had already spread. We needed to draw out every infected cell for a clean excision. I presented the plan in the war room 48 hours later. "We use you as bait," I said, projecting the schematic onto the central table. Caius, who had been leaning over a territorial map, went still. "Explain." "The remaining cells are dormant, paranoid after Lysander's fall. They need a clear, undeniable signal that your rule is vulnerable, that the king is weakened, distracted, emotionally compromised." I highlighted a route on the map, a public procession to the Northern Territories, a show of strength. "We manufacture a security failure, a credible, near-miss assassination attempt during the procession, one that appears to wound you." His expression darkened. "You propose I run from a staged fight? That I show cowardice to my people?" "I propose you show strategic vulnerability to your enemies. They see the Alpha King, bloodied, retreating to his palace under heavy guard. They see opportunity. Their fear of your strength will be overridden by their conviction of your weakness. They will mobilize. And when they do, we will have mapped their entire structure." He slammed a hand on the table, the wood groaning. "No, this violates every instinct. A king does not flinch. A king does not fake a wound. We find them, we corner them, and we crush them. That is the way." "Your way got you cornered in your own throne room," I said, my voice flat. "The way is a liability. This is not about your instincts. It is about systemic eradication." He turned on me, the full force of his presence filling the room. "You would have me play the wounded prey in front of my entire kingdom? You ask me to undermine my own authority. I am asking you to leverage your authority as a tactical variable. Your pride is a data point. The complete neutralization of the threat is the objective." I brought up the predictive models. Probability of success with a direct hunt given their current dormancy, 32%. Probability of success with the bait protocol, 91%. The data is not ambiguous. "I am not data!" The roar was pure alpha, reverberating in the enclosed space. It was the first time he had truly shouted at me. It was the sound of a king whose entire world was built on visible, uncontested power, colliding with a logic that demanded he sacrifice it. I didn't flinch. I met his fury with absolute calm. "You are the principal variable in this operation. Your cooperation is optimal. Your refusal is a critical vulnerability. I have presented the tactically superior path. The decision is yours. But understand this. Choosing your pride over this protocol will result in future breaches, more deaths, a prolonged insurgency. You will be fighting shadows for years, all because you needed to feel like a king in a single moment." The silence that followed was volcanic. His chest heaved, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and rage. He was a sovereign being, faced with an equation where he was the negative integer. He took a step toward me, then another, stopping just outside my perimeter. The fury in his eyes didn't abate, but it changed, cooling into something harder, more devastating. "You win," he said, the words gritted out, stripped of all regal pretense. "Not by force, not by command, by logic." He said the word like it was a foreign, bitter taste. "We will do it your way." It wasn't submission, it was surrender, a king yielding his deepest instinct to a superior strategy. The intimacy of that moment was more profound than any physical touch. He had allowed me to see him not as an alpha, but as a man making a brutal, rational choice. He had laid down a core piece of his identity because my argument was irrefutable. He turned back to the map, his shoulders set with a new, grim resolve. What are the parameters of this credible wound? The plan was set in motion. We moved from argument to execution, but the atmosphere was charged with the aftermath. The professional tension had bled into something far more dangerous, a mutual, terrifying recognition. He had seen the ruthless clarity of my mind, and I had seen the cost of his trust. We had moved beyond client and specialist. We were co-conspirators in a deception that would humiliate a king. The procession was a masterpiece of controlled failure. The assassins were my own hand-picked operatives, using non-lethal rounds tipped with a biocompatible dye that mimicked arterial blood. The shot was perfectly placed, a glancing impact that tore Caius's ceremonial cloak and painted a shockingly vivid bloom of crimson across his shoulder. He played his part flawlessly. The roar of pain that echoed through the square wasn't entirely feigned. The impact was real. The stumble, the way his betas closed ranks in genuine panic, the hurried, chaotic retreat back to the palace gates. It was a perfect tableau of vulnerability. From my position in the surveillance van, I monitored every frequency. The trap was sprung. The bait was taken. Across the city, dormant signals lit up. Encrypted channels buzzed with coded triumph. They were mobilizing. My predictive model flashed green, probability climbing to 94%. The protocol was working. The ensuing confrontation, however, deviated from the script. We had the mastermind's successor, a firebrand named Caius, cornered in a derelict foundry on the city's edge. My plan called for remote containment and automated takedown, another clean, surgical operation. But as the holographic feed showed Caius rallying his remaining followers with a fanatic's zeal, Caius moved. "Enough," he said, his voice a low vibration in the command center. He was still wearing the bloodied tunic, the scent of iron and ozone clinging to him. "This ends now. My way." "Protocol dictates remote neutralization," I stated, my fingers already moving to execute the sequence. "He is in a kill box. There is no need for physical engagement." "There is every need." He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on the feed, on the man who had dared to strike at a king. The humiliation of the staged wound, the forced vulnerability, had banked a fire in him that now demanded a real, visceral release. "This is not a system error to be corrected. This is a challenge to my throne. It must be answered. Personally." I saw the shift in his posture. The calculated king was gone, replaced by the primal alpha. The logic of the protocol meant nothing against the biology of dominance. If I forced the remote takedown now, I would break the fragile trust our partnership was built on. I would prove his fear right, that my system sought to erase his very nature. I halted the command sequence. "If you enter that building, you do so on my terms." I pulled up a tactical overlay. "You will have a 7-second window. I have 7 sniper positions locked on Caius and his lieutenants. If you are not in physical control of the situation within that window, if he so much as raises a weapon you cannot intercept, my operatives will fire. This will be a contained demonstration of your strength, not a brawl." He finally turned his gaze to me. The gold in his eyes was molten. He understood the compromise. I was allowing his confrontation, but I was wrapping it in my control. His victory would happen under my conditions. It was the only way. 7 seconds, he agreed, the words a growl. He moved like a storm. The feed from his body cam was a blur of controlled violence. He breached the foundry door not with stealth, but with shattering force. Caius turned, his fanatic speech dying in his throat. Caius didn't speak. He simply crossed the space, a study in predatory efficiency. The fight, if it could be called that, lasted 5 seconds. Caius was disarmed, pinned, his face pressed against the grimy floor, Caius's knee in his spine. The king's head lifted, and he looked directly into the body cam lens, his chest heaving, the dyed blood stark on his shoulder. A silent declaration. It was a victory. But in the aftermath, back in the secure debriefing room, his fury returned. He paced, the adrenaline crash leaving him raw. "You had snipers on him the entire time," he said, not a question, an accusation. "Contingency protocol. You didn't trust me to finish it." "I trusted the objective. The objective was his neutralization, not your catharsis." I was analyzing the data stream from the other cells we'd identified during the mobilization. The operation was a 98% success. But he didn't see the data. He saw the strings I'd held. "It wasn't a real victory," he spat, stripping off the ruined tunic. "It was a performance, one you directed." "All victories are performances," I replied, my voice cool. The perception of strength is often more critical than its application. You proved your strength to your enemies. I ensured you lived to enjoy the proof. He stopped pacing, standing shirtless in the middle of the room, the artificial wound stark against his skin. The anger bled out of him, replaced by a profound, weary frustration. He had won, but he had won in a cage of my design. The adrenaline was gone, and with it, his defenses. He just looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a king or an alpha, but a man who was utterly, devastatingly tired of the game. He didn't corner me with force. He simply stood there, the scent of his frustration and exhaustion mingling with the sterile air. "What do you want, Vesper?" It was the first time he'd asked a question that wasn't about strategy or security. It was a direct probe into the core of the system. I gave the professional answer. A stable kingdom, a functional client, a secure environment. "That's a lie," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all pretense. "That's what you do, not what you want. What do you want?" The question was a vulnerability scan I hadn't patched for. I retreated behind the protocol. "My wants are irrelevant to the operational parameters. They are a variable I control." "You control everything," he countered, taking a single step closer, not invading my space, but narrowing the field. "You control my movements, my security, even my victories. You build walls of logic and call them protocol. But that isn't what you want. You want—" He paused, his gaze searching my face with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "You want the control because you're terrified of what happens without it." The accuracy was a breach, a direct hit on an unacknowledged server. My heartbeat, a physiological variable I monitored closely, spiked. He saw it. He couldn't hear it, but he saw the slight dilation in my pupils, the minute tightening of my jaw. "You're malfunctioning," I stated, turning away to input a meaningless command into a console. "The adrenaline depletion is causing emotional extrapolation. You should rest." "I'm not the one malfunctioning." His voice was closer. He hadn't moved, but his presence filled the silence behind me. "You saw me surrender my pride today. You saw me yield to your logic. That required trust, a variable you haven't accounted for." "Trust is a statistical probability based on past behavior. It's factored in." "Is it?" He let the question hang. The silence stretched, charged with everything unsaid. The staged wound, the snipers, his surrender in the war room. He had followed my lead into humiliation and violence, and I had watched, clinically, from a distance. I could feel the crack in my own facade, a hairline fracture spreading from the point of impact his question had made. The perfect, silent system had a flaw. It couldn't account for the cost of its own efficiency, on the human element it was meant to protect. On him. "The protocol worked," I said, my back still to him, the words hollow even to me. "I know it worked," he said softly. "That's not what I'm talking about." He didn't press further. He didn't need to. He had identified the fault line. He turned and left the secure room, the door sighing shut behind him. I stood in the blue glow of the consoles, the data streams scrolling with their silent, perfect logic. For the first time, the silence felt like isolation. The control felt like a cage I had built for myself. He had looked past the security chief, past the unshakable specialist, and seen the architect of the walls. And in doing so, he had made the walls visible to me. The crack was there. It wouldn't be patched with logic. He had begun studying me not as a predator studies prey, but as a scholar studies a complex, captivating text. The game had changed. The fortress was no longer impregnable. He had found a question it couldn't answer. The flaw in my system was biological, a virus, to be precise. A mundane, terrestrial pathogen my human immune system had no defense against, likely picked up in the city's lower quarters during the Kale operation. My protocols accounted for ballistic threats, cyber incursions, and chemical agents. They did not account for the common flu. The fever hit fast and high, a systemic crash that overrode all my controls. I was in my quarters, analyzing the final dispersal patterns of the trader network, when the data on my slate began to swim. My temperature was 103.2. My motor functions were degraded by 40%. I tried to stand to initiate a medical alert, and my legs buckled. The world tilted, then went dark. I woke to the scent of ozone and clean linen. I was in my bed, but the sheets were different. The light was wrong. I was in his chambers. The realization was a cold shock through the fever haze. My protocols were compromised. My location was unknown to my own systems. I was in the one place I had structured my entire professional existence to avoid, vulnerable, in the Alpha King's private space. He was there, seated in a chair he'd pulled beside the bed. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't trying to dominate the space with his scent. He was simply present, a data slate in his hand, reading. When he saw my eyes open, he set it aside. "Your security detail found you collapsed," he said, his voice low, devoid of command. "It was just information. Your biometrics triggered a priority alert. My chambers have the only sterile field medical suite in the palace." A logical, operational reason. It didn't explain the chair. It didn't explain him being here instead of a medic. "I need to access my console," I said, my voice a rasp. "Contingency protocols are being handled by your second in command. The system is intact." He reached for a carafe on the side table, poured a glass of water, and held it out. Not demanding I take it, offering. I stared at his hand, at the simple, competent gesture. This was not the alpha who demanded submission. This was the strategist who had learned my protocols well enough to execute them in my absence. He had not seized control. He had assumed a necessary function within the system. The vulnerability was disorienting. He saw my hesitation. "It's water. Hydration is a key variable in recovery." A faint, dry echo of my own terminology. I took the glass. My hand trembled. His fingers brushed mine, steadying it, then retreated immediately. The touch was clinical, necessary. It shouldn't have felt like a breach. Over the next 2 days, he was a constant, quiet variable. He administered medication on schedule. He monitored my vitals on a display he'd synced from the medical suite. He worked from the chair, his presence a silent, steady pressure. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't reference the crack in the secure room. He was just competent. I watched him, through the haze of fever and the clarity of medication. I saw him studying the medical readouts, learning the patterns of my human biology. He wasn't doing this to dominate. He was doing it to understand, to manage a new system that had failed. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. The weakness remained, a profound exhaustion that left me defenseless. He helped me sit up to eat, his arm behind my shoulders, his touch impersonal and solid. In that moment, stripped of my protocols, my control, my professional distance, I had the devastating realization. He hadn't been learning my systems to defeat them. He had been learning them to sustain me. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a relentless, quiet, terrifying competence that mirrored my own. The king had become the caretaker, and I had no protocol for that. My recovery was a system reboot. I ran diagnostics on my physical state, on the palace's security logs during my incapacitation, on Caius's actions. The data was clear. He had maintained operational integrity. He had not exploited the vulnerability. He had patched it. That was the problem. The moment I was cleared for duty, I attempted a full system restoration. I returned to my quarters. I reinstated all previous protocols. I addressed him in the war room with the same clinical distance. The medical incident was an anomaly. Thank you for maintaining continuity. We will resume standard operations. He watched me from his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. No. The single word was a system shock. Explain. I'm refusing your reversion. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. The posture wasn't aggressive. It was analytical. My own posture. Your need for absolute control is your primary vulnerability, Vesper. It's a single point of failure. When you crashed, the system didn't fail. You did. Because you built a system that only you can operate. I kept my voice level. That is the definition of a secure system. limited access points. It's the definition of a fragile one. He stood and began to pace, not with alpha restlessness, but with the methodical cadence of a man working through a logic puzzle. You treat emotion, trust, dependency, all of it as variables to be eliminated. But they're not variables, they're components. You can't design a system that excludes core components and call it strong. You can only call it isolated. Isolation is secure. Isolation is a dead end. He stopped, turning to face me. I've analyzed your protocols. I understand their elegance. Their flaw is that they are designed for a machine, not for a kingdom, not for people, and certainly not for you. The air left the room. He had been auditing me, not my work, my architecture. You present your infertility as a shield, he continued, his voice dropping, becoming terrifyingly precise. You present your control as strength, but they're the same thing. They are walls. You built them after a radiation burn wiped out a part of your biology. You built them after a system failure, as you call it, cost you something. You are not preventing failure. You are building a monument to it. Every word was a direct hit on encrypted servers I thought were buried. My pulse was a static hum in my ears. I had no protocol for this, for being seen with this devastating clarity. What is your proposal? My voice was thin, the professional facade cracking under the weight of his analysis. A new contract. He walked to the desk, picked up a data slate, and slid it across the polished surface toward me. Not employment. Partnership. I looked at the slate. The heading was simple: Joint Security Command Protocol. It outlined shared authority, integrated systems, mutual veto power on critical decisions. It was a blueprint for a merger, not a hierarchy. Partnership requires trust, I said, the words automatic, a final line of defense. I know. He didn't smile. His gaze was steady, intense. That's the point. You are the most capable, most formidable mind I have ever encountered. You are also the most terrified. This, he gestured at the slate, is my offer. Not to conquer your fortress, to share the architecture, to be the redundant system you refuse to build for yourself. The offer was a black hole, warping all my logical space. It solved for every vulnerability he'd named. It also required the one thing my system was designed to prevent: surrendering sole control, letting someone inside the walls. I reached for the slate. My fingers hovered over the signature field. The logic was impeccable. The data supported the model. A partnership would increase systemic resilience by over 60%. It was the optimal solution. And I couldn't do it. I pulled my hand back as if burned. The retreat was physical, visceral. I need to run further simulations, I heard myself say, the words hollow, a pathetic echo of my usual precision. The variables are not fully accounted for. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He gave a single, slow nod. The unaccounted variable is you, Vesper. The part of you that doesn't trust the system because it can't secure the architect. He left the slate on the table. The offer stands. When you're ready to negotiate with your own fear, I'll be here. He left me alone in the war room, the partnership contract glowing on the desk. The reason for my retreat was a screaming silence in my mind. Partnership required trust, and trust was a system I couldn't secure because it required me to believe the walls were no longer necessary. It required me to believe I wouldn't get burned again, and my entire life was proof that I would. The unresolved negotiation became a new kind of protocol, a silent agreement to function in parallel. He didn't mention the partnership contract again. I didn't leave the palace. We operated in a state of tense, perfect equilibrium, two systems running side by side without integration. The silence was its own language. It was broken by an external variable. The rival Alpha Kingdom of Thorn, on our northern border, caught the scent of weakness. Their intelligence, pieced together from the debris of Lysander's failed coup and the public spectacle of Caius's wounding, reached a flawed conclusion. The Alpha King was being manipulated, softened, by a human female. They saw my presence not as a strategic upgrade, but as a catastrophic vulnerability, an opportunity. Their advance team infiltrated within days. Not to strike at the palace, but to abduct the human liability and shatter Caius's perceived weakness in one move. My own perimeter alerts flagged the incursion, a sophisticated, multi-vector probe testing the palace's digital and physical defenses. It was a competent threat. It was also a gift. Caius's response was immediate, visceral. He moved me into his private wing, a logistical nightmare for security, but a biological imperative for him. The force proximity was constant, a violation of every professional boundary we'd ever established. He was a shadow, his presence a wall of simmering, protective fury. He didn't speak of partnership. He spoke in tactical updates, his voice tight with a rage that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with possession. I let him believe it was for my protection. In reality, it was the perfect containment field. With the threat vector focused on me, and me physically located within a controlled, sensor-saturated environment, I could run the Thorn operatives through my predictive algorithms in real time. They weren't hunting me. I was hurting them. For 72 hours, we worked in the same room, a replay of our investigation, but charged with a different, more dangerous current. He tracked their movements through pack scouts and territorial instinct. I tracked them through data patterns, communication intercepts, and behavioral modeling. He would growl a location, their scent marking the old river gate, and I would cross-reference it with signal traffic, predicting their next rally point before his scouts could report back. The climax was a trap of my own design. I fed false biometric data into the palace's external security feed, suggesting I was being moved to a secondary location for safety. It was irresistible bait. The entire Thorn Advance team converged on a derelict transport depot on the city's edge, a location I had pre-selected for its total lack of civilian presence and its excellent SIGINT isolation. Caius watched the final phase from the command console beside me. On the main display, the Thorn operatives moved into the kill box, their thermal signatures bright against the cold backdrop. I didn't order a strike. I initiated Protocol Echo, a full-spectrum electromagnetic pulse coupled with a targeted, non-lethal neuroinhibitor gas deployed through the depot's ancient climate control. On the screen, the bright signatures wavered, then dropped, one by one, into unconsciousness. Not a single shot fired. Not a single life taken. Just 32 highly trained operatives neutralized, asleep in the dust, ready for collection and diplomatic repatriation. The silence in the command center was absolute. Caius stared at the screen, then at me, his earlier fury gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated awe. It wasn't the admiration of a king for a weapon. It was the reverence of a strategist for a work of art. I had turned an Alpha Kingdom's military advance into a silent, humiliating footnote. "You outmaneuvered an entire Alpha advance team," he said, his voice hushed. "Without a battle, without a declaration of war. You just made them irrelevant." "The optimal solution is the one that expends the least resources for the maximum gain," I said, shutting down the active protocols. War is a high-cost, high-variable endeavor. This was a controlled demonstration. They are neutralized, their kingdom is humiliated, they will not try again. He continued to look at me, the gold in his eyes blazing with a light I had never seen before. It was the final, irrevocable shift. His obsession, his fascination, his relentless pursuit. It all crystallized in that moment into something solid, unbreakable, and terrifyingly close to love. It was respect, not for my strength, but for the sublime, terrifying elegance of my mind. The predator had not just found a worthy mate. He had found a goddess of a different pantheon, and he was utterly, irrevocably devoted. The adrenaline of the Thorn operation bled away, leaving the command center in a vacuum of quiet. The screens were dark, the data streams stilled. The only sound was the low hum of climate control and the sound of our breathing. He hadn't moved from his position beside me. I began the standard post-operation shutdown sequence. My fingers moved over the console, logging the event, archiving the sensor data, initiating the cleanup protocol for the depot. It was routine. It was a lifeline back to the known world of systems and constants. His hand closed over mine on the console, stilling my movement. His touch wasn't a command. It was an anchor. Warm, solid, real. I froze. My protocols had no response for this. This was not a breach of the perimeter. This was a suspension of the rules of physics. "Look at me," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of everything but a raw, unbearable honesty. I didn't want to. Looking at the data was safe. Looking at him was a system crash waiting to happen. But my head turned anyway, a mechanical failure of my own design. His face was a map of everything we'd been through. The staged humiliation, the shared investigation, the fever, the silent standoff, and now this victory that felt like a loss. The gold in his eyes wasn't predatory. It was just open. "You are the most terrifying and beautiful thing I have ever known," he said. The words simple, devastating in their lack of calculation. "You build perfect, silent worlds, and you live inside them, alone. You think your infertility and your control make you safe. They just make you lonely." The diagnosis was absolute. I had no counter-argument. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs, a biological variable I could not dampen. "I don't want to conquer you, Vesper," he continued, his thumb moving in a slow, deliberate arc over the back of my hand. A touch that spoke of study, of reverence, not possession. "I want to be admitted, as a partner, as a constant. Not in your bed because I need an heir. In your orbit because I cannot conceive of a universe that doesn't have your mind at the center of it." It was the offer from the war room, stripped of its contractual language and laid bare. It was a request for access to the core system, for integration. I opened my mouth. A denial, a deflection, a professional assessment, any of them should have come. Nothing did. The silence stretched, and in it, the walls I'd built showed their true nature. They weren't fortifications. They were isolation cells. And he was standing at the only door, not with a battering ram, but with a key. I didn't say yes. I didn't say anything. But I also didn't pull my hand away. I left it there, under his, in the humming silence of the dark command center. It was the first piece of data I had ever given him that wasn't part of a report or a protocol. It was just a fact. His touch was not a threat my system rejected. He read the data. He didn't press. He didn't claim victory. He simply nodded, a slow, profound acknowledgement, and released my hand. The loss of the contact was a sudden, shocking cold. "The offer stands," he repeated, his voice soft. Then he turned and left the room, giving me back my silence, my control, my empty, perfect fortress. I stood there for a long time, my hands still tingling with the memory of his warmth. The unspoken admission hung in the air between us, more binding than any signed contract. He had named my loneliness, and in doing so, he had made it impossible to ignore. The external threat was neutralized. The data was archived. The system should have returned to its stable, silent equilibrium. It didn't. The unspoken admission had introduced a persistent, low-level error into my operational code. I could feel it, a background process consuming resources, a query running in a loop with no clear resolution. Caius gave me space. He didn't press. He simply existed within the palace as a new kind of constant, his presence no longer a variable to be managed, but a fixed parameter in my environment. The breach happened 3 nights later. I was in the central server core, running a deep diagnostic on the network's new intrusion countermeasures. It was a routine procedure, one I always performed alone. The core was a cold, silent vault of blinking lights and server stacks, the heart of my digital kingdom. The only sound was the whisper of cooling fans and the tap of my fingers on a portable terminal. I didn't hear him enter. One moment I was alone. The next, I could feel the shift in the air pressure, the subtle scent of ozone and frost cutting through the sterile, processed atmosphere. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me. He was dressed not in royal finery or tactical gear, but in simple, dark clothes. He looked like a shadow given substance. "Protocol dictates this room is off limits during maintenance," I stated, not looking up from my terminal. My voice echoed flatly in the chamber. I know, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. I'm breaching it. The admission was so blunt, it stalled my next command. I finally looked at him. This is a critical infrastructure node. Your presence is a contamination risk. I'm aware. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step into the room. Not a predatory advance, a simple, deliberate trespass. Your protocols are flawless, Vesper. They account for everything except one thing. And what is that? Me. He stopped a few feet away, well inside the perimeter that had always been mine alone. You've built a world where I am either a client, a threat, or a variable. You have no protocol for me as a man standing in a room with you. No subroutine for a conversation that isn't about a threat assessment or a tactical update. The diagnostic on my screen completed, flashing green. Irrelevant. The real system failure was happening right in front of me. This is a secured location. The conversation is a security lapse. No, he corrected, his gaze holding mine. This is the one place in the entire kingdom you consider truly yours. The one room your control is absolute. I'm not here as your king. I'm not here to negotiate a contract. I'm here because you left the door unlocked. A cold clarity washed over me. He was right. The biometric lock on the server core door was keyed to me. And to him. I had added his signature weeks ago, during the fever, when I'd needed him to access system logs. I had never removed it. It was an oversight, a flaw. I had left a back door into my own central nervous system, and he had just walked through it. It was an administrative error, I said, the words sounding hollow. It was a choice. He took another step closer. The hum of the servers seemed to grow louder, a frantic chorus to the silent standoff. You can lie to your reports. You can't lie to your own architecture. You gave me a key. This is you negotiating with your own fear. This is the system reaching for its redundant backup. I had no response. Every protocol, every deflection, every wall of logic crumbled under the weight of that simple, devastating truth. I had left the door unlocked. On purpose. Because some part of the system, some deep, unpatched subroutine, wanted him to find it. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The breach was complete. He had bypassed every external defense and stood now in the sanctum, not as a conqueror, but as an invited guest. The vulnerability was total. And for the first time, staring at the living, breathing proof of my own subconscious failure, I didn't feel afraid. I felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of alignment. The system had finally encountered a variable it couldn't quarantine, and instead of crashing, it was integrating. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full.